I always leave 15 minutes for comments, but I always have 5, so we're still good on time. Don't worry. Welcome to the University of Nebraska, the Agriculture Research and Development Center. We call it Mead because we're close to the town of Mead, Nebraska. Many of you have been here, but some of you are new to this facility, and appreciate everybody coming today. Hopefully they got you parked and all of that. There's restrooms on both sides of the building. There are refreshments down front here for the break. So, make yourself at home. Just don't destroy the place, which is probably not very risky for that. Normally when we have meetings here, there's a wall right behind me, but there was fairly good interest for the meeting, and so we decided to open up the wall, and hopefully this will still work okay. The speakers, I believe, are working in this room as well. And I figured the front would remain open first, so for those that come in now, they'll have to sit up front. So this is a little bit different than maybe what we normally do here at the University of Nebraska. We normally host a nutrition conference in the fall targeted at feedlot consultants. And we were discussing this. I think it was Angel and I and Dan Loy. Angel and I started the discussions well over a year and a half ago. Angels with Lallemand, and we were discussing that, we're doing a lot of things in the silage arena and seem to get a lot of interest and calls, and we think it's pretty economical. I'm not stealing Terry's thunder because he's on the program at the end to talk about if that's a true statement or not. But because we were doing a lot of things, and obviously given Lallemand Animal Nutrition's interest in silage, and their work in that arena too, we teamed up. And also teamed up with Dan Loy and the Iowa Beef Center and decided we would host a conference. And then we were talking about, well, when would you do that? Well, if we do it in November during our regular nutrition conference cycle, that's not very useful until the following August, right? And so we decided, let's go ahead and deviate and have a truly silage-focused meeting. Do it about this time of year so that this information's readily available for any decision making yet this summer when silage harvest time comes around. So that's how this developed, and been numerous people with Iowa State, numerous people with Lallemand, Wendy Hashan, who's here, you'll meet, and others have been super helpful in preparing this. So hopefully it's a good conference. Hopefully you'll enjoy the day and learn something is really our goal. You have multiple things. You at your seat, you should have had a silage management technical guide, a silage safety handbook, which will be referred to some later, and of course a very nice notebook or notepad from Lallemand. You also should have had your name tag. That'll be important for your lunch process today, but you also should have received the proceedings that we've used or developed for this meeting. So each of these papers were done by the speakers, and I think is really good, valuable information to take home with you. Now, and then you also received a jump drive, which has the proceedings on it electronically, as well as a corn silage pricing calculator, which we will show you at the end of the meeting. So that's all the stuff you should have sitting in front of you right now. I want to be clear, if you forget something today, don't worry about that on your drive home. I'm sure that's going to happen if you forget something or you can't recall exactly something Dr. Charley or Dr. Bolson or somebody says. The meeting is being recorded, and it's being webcast thanks to Jeannie and others at Iowa State. They will have questions, and so we'll be able to track who's online and who's listening on the webcast version, and they may have questions which we'll take at the end of each talk. So what's my point? If you forget something, you'll be able to go back and watch the full recording of each speaker. And also what we've started recently is we've been working on developing have any of you watched TED Talks, they call it? You've seen those online? They're short, 5 to 10 minute, sometimes longer snippets, if you will, on some topic. So we've challenged every speaker, I hope I'm not surprising any of them, to give a TED Talk, which will be recorded in the library room here in the building. So here's my point. If you forget something, you can download the long version or the short version, either way. You probably will go to the short version first. That's been our experience, and that's why we're doing that, is that we find that if people want to view something online, they lose interest after about 5 minutes. So we'll try and get them everything they need in the first 5 minutes. Okay, with that, Dr. Loy will be on later, and so he'll have an opportunity to make some comments. And I think we'll go ahead and get started with our first speaker, Dr. Bob Charley. Many of you know, who's with the Lallemand, and he's going to make some comments as well about Lallamand's involvement in the meeting. What we also did this year is, I think most of you know every one of the speakers, but in case not, at the beginning of each of their papers, I've included a bio and some information about each speaker, which I think is very useful because it gives you some context on the speakers. Dr. Charley's been with Lallemand Animal Nutrition in the technical sales support and sales training area. He's also in the developing educational materials for their forage product line in North America. He's worked heavily with their Lactobacillus buchneri technology and worldwide. He's received his bachelor's degree from the University of Wales and his PhD from the University of Strathclyde. He joined Lallemand Animal Nutrition in December of 2000. So I very much appreciate you being here, Dr. Charley, and look forward to your comments.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thanks to the University of Nebraska and Iowa State, and also to our own marketing people for working so hard to pull this thing together in what really seemed like quite a short time. As Galen said, this all started just over a year ago when we were concluding a couple of trials with the University of Nebraska, silage trials that went on to feeding studies. And Galen mentioned to Angel Aguilar, my colleague in technical services, that he was interested in the idea of having a conference about silage and silage quality and stuff for the beef industry. And we were very interested because it was a subject that we had identified ourselves as something that we wanted to pursue. And so our aims really came together brilliantly right from the very beginning. And so we jumped on board very quickly, and we agreed to sponsor this meeting. And as I say, our various teams collaborated together to make sure that this all came off. My talk is about the corn silage fermentation process. And for those of you who intend to try and follow along by reading the paper in the book, good luck, because the presentation and the paper are not in the same sequence. When I wrote the paper, you might realize from the opening sentence, no, I wasn't drunk. I wrote the paper to try and make it like a story that would suck people in and get them interested before they realized how boring the subject was. And by the time they finally realized, actually, this is pretty dull stuff, they'd have finished and read the thing. So it was written very much like trying to tell a story about the silage fermentation process and stuff, whereas the presentation is a presentation. So if you try to follow it along in the paper, you'll find that sort of like the slides are going to be out of sequence with what you see in the booklet. So you might want to put the booklet to one side and just kind of listen for a while. Galen mentioned my background, and you probably all sort of thought, University of Wales, University of Strathclyde, what the heck is that? Oh yeah, by the way, my colleagues have warned me that not only do we have a large crowd here today, but we have several people coming in through E-Link or whatever it's called. So we've got participants around the country listening in, so they warned me about my language. So I'm trying to keep everything clean and nice, like I do have this unfortunate British habit of using these sort of like British slang stroke swear words from time to time, so I'm trying to avoid that. At the University of Wales, I did actually a biology degree, and at the University of Strathclyde, my PhD is in applied microbiology, but more importantly, it was fermentation technology. And so I kind of been blessed throughout my career to be able to put into practice the exact things that I studied doing my BSc and my PhD. Because everything that I've done in my employment history has been fermentation, basically. Silage is a fermentation, as it says on the screen there. The rumen is a huge, great fermentation vat. So, like, all of the basic knowledge that I gained, you know, like in those formative years, I've been able to put into process, into application. So, let's look at the fermentation process. This graph just shows the sort of like major sort of like chemical changes that occur during the fermentation process. And the major points to draw are really that sugars and the pH come down and pretty much everything else comes up. And the timescale on this graph is said to be like 21 days. It can be a lot faster depending on the size of the fermentation system. It can be a lot slower depending on the management skills practiced and stuff like that. The important thing to realize is that although it looks that like there is still a lot of dynamic change going on at the end of this graph, as this graph finishes, things like lactic acid and acetic acid and that tend to peak and plateau off. But there are still some changes going on. Ammonia will still tend to increase a bit. And in terms of the corn silage fermentation in particular, or ensiling corn in particular, it's important to know that over the course of the next N months, the digestibility of the starch in the corn continues to change. It continues to increase. Now, this change is going to be somewhat dependent on varieties. You know, harder kernel varieties are going to sort of like increase in digestibility a bit more slowly than floury varieties. But this is one concrete, solid piece of data that was published in 2006 by a researcher called Newbold. There was a study done at the University of Delaware by Lallemand group more recently, which basically reproduced this graph. But it's interesting to see that, like, there's a period. Oops, sorry, pressing the wrong button there. That'll look good on the video. There's a period of stasis at the beginning, and then the silage digestibility starts to increase and continues to increase from months 4 to 10. And what that graph would tend to say is, like, ideally we'd leave the corn silage sit for about a year before we feed it, because otherwise we're going to be leaving digestibility on the table in a way. At the very least, it says that this silage is still dynamic, it's still changing. The starch digestibility is changing, and fairly rapidly. And so we need to take that into account when we're designing rations, so that, you know, like during the course of the feeding, if we start to feed after a month or two, we really should be testing the starch digestibility once or twice a month to see what the starch digestibility levels are, so that we can make ration adjustments as necessary. This is just some data from a paper that Lehman Kung and Randy Shaver put out a while ago. It shows the typical fermentation end products in a range of different silages, and I only included the others on there so you can see the kind of comparison. What it shows is that corn silage typically tends to be slightly lower in pH than grass or legume silages, and high moisture corn for that matter. The lactic acid level is somewhat lower, and, you know, the ammonia is also lower as well. The reason for that is because corn is a much more lowly buffered sort of material at harvest. It has a lower protein content, and so it's less resistant to pH drops, so you need less acid to bring the pH down. So it naturally, inherently ends up at a lower pH, despite the fact that it has lower levels of lactic acid, etc. If we strip this fermentation process down to its basics, it's really a pretty simple process. We're talking about bringing a crop off the field at a near neutral pH, pH 6.5, something like that, bringing it down below 5 as quickly as possible, and then just keeping it there. And why 5? Why do I draw in 5? Because, you know, all of you have probably heard that, like, silage needs to be pH 4 or lower. Well, that's not entirely true. pH 5 is a critical control point, because that's the point at which we stop the growth of things like Clostridia, Enterobacteria, Listeria, E. coli. It's also the point at which we shut down most of the plant's own enzyme systems that are trying to break the plant down and return it to the soil to feed the next generation of plant. So the speed of getting down below pH 5 is all important. And where we end up is somewhat immaterial. It's more dependent on the dry matter of the crop, the type of the crop. As I said, if it's corn silage, it's going to be naturally lower in pH anyway. And if the pH ends up at 4.5 and the material is stable and it's feeding well, there's no reason for concern. In fact, the producer who's got that material should probably be happy because he's got a higher, a lower acidity feed that he's got good stability with, and it'll have excellent feeding properties. And I mentioned this buffering capacity thing. You know, corn is pretty simple to ensile as a crop because of this low buffering capacity. So this just shows the buffering capacity of some of the major crops. The higher on the table, the higher the buffering capacity, so the more acid we need to produce and the more sugar we need to drive that acid production. So you can see that like whole plant corn is right at the bottom there. And the reason for these spreads of values is, I mentioned about protein. Protein is the main buffering material, the main resistance to pH drop in these crops. So the different buffering capacities for the one crop is really dependent on the protein level in the crop. So it's a simple process. It's about bringing pH down below 5 as quickly as possible, and the crop itself is relatively simple in style in terms of resistance to pH drop. But there are still things that can go wrong. And this graph just shows some of the things that can happen. We can get a slow pH drop, which can lead to a clostridial fermentation. We can get yeast growing if we get air into the silage and dragging the pH up. Or we can get an extended fermentation, which ends up in a lower pH. And the important thing is that the difference here between the ideal and the non-ideal, we're losing money. We're losing energy, we're losing dry matter and stuff out of the crop, which ultimately is production, and so it's loss of money. And part of that loss is purely down to dry matter losses. This just shows the major fermentation pathways that can occur in silage and what the dry matter recoveries are from those major fermentation pathways. If we have a heterolactic fermentation by lactic acid bacteria, from this mixture of 6 carbon sugars, we end up with 10 lactic acid molecules, nothing else, just purely lactic acid, and the dry matter recovery is 100%. If we have a, did I say heterolactic? I should have said homolactic, sorry. If we have a heterolactic fermentation on that same mixture of sugars, we end up with this mixture of end products. We still get a bit of lactic acid and 1 acetic acid, but we get some carbon dioxide being produced. Carbon dioxide is a gas, so therefore we're losing dry matter, and so the dry matter recovery drops to about 88%. Also, though, the important thing is that like the impact on the pH drop is much less significant, because here we've got 10 lactic acids, here we've only got 3 lactic acids and 1 acetic. And if you look at the organic acids, the strongest of the organic acids, the fermentation acids anyway, is lactic acid. It's the strongest in terms of ability to bring the pH down. So we've only got 30% of the lactic acid being produced, and then we've got 1 slightly weaker acetic acid, so we've got much less dramatic effect on pH. And that's why we can get that slower pH drop, which can then lead to these associated problems. If we get yeast fermentation going on, the yeast can take the sugars and they can also convert lactic acid and they produce ethanol and lots of carbon dioxide. The dry matter recovery drops off the table. You know, almost 50% dry matter losses. And if we get Clostridia growing, they can also convert both sugars and lactic acid, and we get butyric acid produced, again with loads of carbon dioxide, and again with around 50% dry matter losses. But the note at the bottom there is to caution that it's not just about dry matter, because these bugs are relatively simple organisms, and being simple organisms, they use the most highly nutritious, easily utilizable sources of food and energy first. So they use up all the fermentable sugars, they use up all the amino acids and stuff like that, which means that the value of the material that's left behind, even if you've got 85% dry matter recovery, the feed value of it is compromised because you've lost all of the most digestible stuff out of there because the microbes have taken it. Because in the end of the day, it's going into the rumen to feed microbes in the rumen. So the microbes in the silage have stolen it from the microbes in the rumen, if you like. So that's why in my paper I describe it as like this microbial war of the worlds. And this just shows the typical plant populations at ensiling. This is from a paper by a guy called Parlow and a group of people. It was in a publication published in the US, a great big volume on silage technology that came out in 2003. And this is the table that everybody refers to in terms of like populations on crops. I have to say that to my dismay, when I went back to the source material and looked at it, I found out that it isn't about populations on corn silage at all. It's about plant populations in general, and most of the data comes from Europe, which tends to tell me it's probably, some of it's on corn silage, but some of it certainly won't be. But nonetheless, it paints a kind of picture. The picture on corn silage, on standing corn, is going to be slightly different to what it is on alfalfa, to what it is on grass. But the thing is that, like, it's going to be different today than it is tomorrow, than it is a week from now, than it is a month from now. The microbial population is dynamic and it changes with time. So that from a younger crop or a younger material in the field, you tend to have bacteria dominating the population. As the plant gets older, you tend to move more to yeasts and molds. But what this shows is that, like, regardless, the dominant population is aerobic bacteria. And that's not surprising because the plant is standing there up in the air, and so the organisms that are going to dominate are ones that grow aerobically. So things like lactic acid bacteria, which can grow in the presence of air but prefer anaerobic environments, their population is going to be somewhat lower. And then the true anaerobes like Clostridia and things like that are going to be in much lower populations, and they're going to be there because they're surviving as spores. And then we've got yeasts and molds, a fair range of populations there. You can see from 1,000 to 100,000 for yeasts. And what I would say is that, like, if we're looking at corn, corn could be much higher than 100,000. It could be several million going into the silage pit, depending on the time at which it's taken, the kind of stresses that the crop has been exposed to and stuff like that. One thing on this chart that's really sort of like significant, though, is that, like, the lactic population, the lactic acid bacteria population, can range anything from single digits to sort of like up to 1 million, or more than 1 million, to be honest, but maybe 10 million as a peak. But that population could be 90% or more homolactic or 90% or more heterolactic. And there's no real rhyme or reason to it. Maybe if I spent 10 lifetimes studying it, I might find that there is actually a cause, and it's weather related, and it's due to the humidity and the sugars that are coming up and stuff like that. But nobody really knows now. Nobody could be able to predict what the population of lactic bacteria would be and what the proportion of heterolactics to homolactics would be. So to me, that's the one single biggest thing that people should look at and see, why should I inoculate silage? And I'm not here to talk about inoculants because my esteemed colleague is going to do that later on. But the reason why people should inoculate silage is because it's an insurance package against this extremely variable population of lactic acid bacteria on the crop at ensiling. So what we're looking at, as I described in my little paper that I told you not to read as we go along through this, is this microbial war of the worlds between the good guys and the bad guys, where we're hoping that the good guys, the lactic acid bacteria, are going to dominate and swamp out the bad guys. And winning that battle pays off by reducing those dry matter losses that I showed you earlier on. We've proven this in independent trials that we've done. This is just a bunch of trials that we've done with our products, where you can see the untreated control versus treated material, an average improvement in just over 4% in dry matter recovery. So, you know, it pays off. If that's the only thing that you get, it pays off to do that because you can improve the dry matter recovery by that factor. But an efficient fermentation is, first off, dependent on the rapid achievement of anaerobic conditions in the silage, because the lactic acid bacteria produce only lactic acid from 6-carbon sugars like glucose and fructose only when they're fermenting. They do produce some lactic acid when they're growing aerobically, but it's only about 50% of the sugar goes to lactic acid when there's air around. But as soon as the situation becomes anaerobic, they go over a pure lactic acid production, and that's all they produce. So obviously we want to get to that point as quickly as possible so that we start the fermentation, because we haven't even got the fermentation started yet. So we want to get that started as quickly as possible. And this just lists some of the factors that are important in getting that anaerobic status established. There's the moisture content and chop length of the crop, which are major impactors on the porosity of the silage, the ability of air to infiltrate into the silage, if you like. The fill layer thickness. 6 inches is the rule of thumb, and it is the major impactor on the packing density that you will achieve. If you go to this University of Wisconsin extension site and go through, you can find a packing density calculator, and if you play around on that calculator, you'll find that the single biggest impactor is packing layer thickness. And so that's the thing that needs to be managed above all, really. And it's an increasing challenge these days as like harvesting machinery gets bigger and bigger and outstrips the capacity of the unloaders and the packing tractors to keep up. So it's something that people have to keep on top of, really, positively manage. So that means speed of filling, obviously, and filling technique. We want a progressive wedge in order to minimize the surface area and increase the packing density. We want the slopes to be a maximum of 4:1 run ratio or 25% slope. We need to have adequate packing weight, and that's just the rule of thumb for calculating what packing weight you need on the tractors. As I say, if you go to the University of Wisconsin extension site, you'll find there's a much more sophisticated calculator that you can use in there. And we need rapid and effective covering and sealing, which I'm not going to talk about much because that's Dr. Bolton's job later on. So this is just, from our management guide. It just shows that the 4:1 slope can be achieved, and look at the nice quality of face and silage preservation that you get because of it. And also, if you operate at a 4:1 or 25% slope, you get safe packing. The tractors are able to run up and down with no danger of toppling over or whatever. And that needs to be the slope in every direction, not just the ramp, not just the sides, but in every direction. And that's just a plug for the book that you've got there, because everything that I'm talking about today, and, if you ever come to hear me again, it's probably summarized in our technical guide, which you can read with absolute impunity. There is absolutely no commercial information in there whatsoever. It's purely written as an educational piece. We actually give out hundreds of copies a year to different universities who request them for their beginning sort of like ag courses and stuff like that. So you can read it, not be worried about being brainwashed or anything like that. It's purely an educational piece that I would recommend as a sort of like a good 80-something page read, just to sort of like bring you up to speed on silage management stuff. The effect of getting some of these not quite right. Well, this is the classic graph that comes from Kurt Ruppel's work when he did his master's at Cornell in 1992. Everybody will probably gasp and think, 1992, good Lord, I wasn't born then. Well, I was, but you weren't, maybe. Angel was. But the sad fact is that nobody's ever reproduced this work, because it's a huge body of work to actually, set up facilities and manage the packing densities, measure the packing densities, and then measure the dry matter losses. So nobody's ever actually reproduced it, so we all go referencing back to Kurt Ruppel's work. And you can see, the higher the packing density, the lower the dry matter losses. So we always tend to recommend about 16 pounds of dry matter per cubic foot as a sort of like a minimum target, if you like. Now, that's a dry matter packing density basis. Earlier on I mentioned porosity, and nowadays there's more of a trend towards like trying to sort of like state this in terms of porosity or even bulk density, which is fresh weight packing density, because porosity is dependent on the moisture level of the crop, so it's much more relevant what the bulk packing density or fresh packing density is than the dry matter packing density. If we are slow filling, this is from Lehman Kung's lab at the University of Delaware. You can see delayed fill, and you've got increased dry matter losses from slow filling or delayed filling. I think there's 3 graphs on this in the paper that show, dry matter losses, sugar reduction, and yeast population, but this just summarizes the dry matter loss. And then if we look at ineffective covering, this is a study done again at the University of Delaware. An awful lot of the research on silage management practices and that in recent times has been done by the Delaware group. That's why, I'm citing them endlessly. This was actually a study where they were looking at side plastic and looking at the effect of putting an oxygen barrier film down the sides versus not. And so the purple is not, the K-State colours is not. I'm sure I got this the wrong way round, Keith would say. I should have had the Silage stop colours in purple because of K-State. But you can see that, where we've got the uncovered material or the ineffective cover, we've got less NDF digestibility, so we've lost digestible material. Actually, I've got this the right way around. The purple is the good, so Keith should be happy. So this is the good side barrier, if you like, and this is the poor side barrier. You can see, this is like the first 18 inches or so, this is the next 18, and then this is the next 18. You can see there's some significant digestibility losses from ineffective sealing. So all of these factors play in to the quality of the material that we're going to end up with at the end of the day. There is some help, though, from the lactic acid bacteria themselves, because as I mentioned earlier on, they can actually grow in the presence of air as well. So what we're looking to try and do is go from aerobic conditions to anaerobic conditions so that we've got this efficient fermentation going on. And the lactic acid bacteria can actually help drive that because they can grow aerobically as well. So they can grow aerobically as well. They produce a little bit less lactic acid, but then once it's anaerobic, boom, off they go. Lactic acid, here it comes, like by the bucketful. So now, we've had our fermentation. We've gone through all of this. We've gone through the fermentation. We've dropped the pH. Hopefully then we've got a period of stability and we get into, long-term storage and stability and then feed out and the product remaining stable at feed out. The problem is that we can get yeasts growing in the presence of air. And this is a graph from an institute in Holland. This was done in the mid-90s. And it shows small-scale silos, little drain pipe silos, if you like. These are sealed at this point here. They've got a little bung in the side of the silo, so they stick a needle in and bleed in oxygen to a level of 2.5% for 6 days. Why 2.5%? Because some other scientist in Germany measured the level of oxygen at the aerobic interface in the silage, where you're going back through the silage and you've got the silage surface, but the oxygen goes back into the face. Well, this German guy measured, at a depth of, say, 2 feet, it was 2.5% oxygen. So that was the level that they used. They bled that in, and then they opened the stuff up, fluffed it up to simulate feed out, if you like. And what you can see is the yeast population remains relatively stable during the ensiling period. As soon as the oxygen starts to come in, the yeast population takes off. So it goes from 100,000, log 5, to log 7, which is 10 million. So, from 100,000 to 10 million because during the transition in that aerobic interface. And if you think about the standard recommendation is, minimum of 6 inches a day. So if you were feeding 6 inches a day, then your aerobic interface, would be about 3 feet. If your aerobic interface is 3 feet, it's going to take you 6 days to get through it. So 6 days of stability is pretty much what you need in, a lot of dairy silos anyway. But, beef guys, you guys are feeding stuff out so quickly, it's much less of a significant effect for you. But you can see that once that yeast population finally hits the air at feed out, you get, again, dramatic growth, which is heat associated with it, dry matter losses associated with it, etc. And the stability in the silage is directly related to the yeast population. Over 99% of heating events in silage are caused by yeasts, and this just shows the correlation of yeast population with stability. You can see the higher the yeast population, the lower the stability, and for us to get that 5 or 6 days of stability, we're talking about needing a very low yeast population, below about 100 CFUs per gram. What happens is the yeasts start to get growing, their numbers increase, they degrade all the readily digestible nutrients, they produce heat, they increase the pH, and then molds and bacteria can get going, causing massive, significant spoilage. And that's where the dry matter and nutrient losses can really get serious. We talked initially about fermentation, and during the fermentation processes, you can see that the potential dry matter losses are in the sort of like 10%-ish range in total. When we get to the secondary or aerobic fermentation stages, we're talking about greater than 25% losses. So it can be significantly more than 25%, but, it's a big number. And remember that I said that it's the most highly digestible nutrients that go first. So if we ever get this yeast population running out of control, we've really just got sticks left behind and sticks that are contaminated with molds. And feeding that spoiled silage is not a good thing. It's a great temptation. Well, it's all I've got, or, I've only got limited amount of silage. The cattle don't really notice it if I blend it in anyway. But it's a bad thing. This is from Professor Bolton's group at KSU. Lance Whitlock was the lead researcher. And it shows if you include spoiled silage into the ration, you significantly decrease the dry matter intake of the cattle. This is feedlot steers. And you also significantly decrease the dry matter digestibility, even with relatively low levels of inclusion of spoiled silage. And the reason for that is that the spoiled silage was breaking up the rumen mat. And so, the rumen mat is the site of fibre degradation, and so therefore we're breaking up the workbench for fibre degradation, and degradation slows and disappears, basically. But we can overcome that. This is a corn silage study done at farm scale in actually bagged silos, and we're looking at aerobic losses. This one's good management -1, which I'll mention in a minute. This is best management practice, so everything done properly. And you can see that in going from really good management practices to real best management practices, we get a 4.4% improvement in dry matter recovery. That single improvement there is basically using an inoculant to keep the stuff aerobically stable at feed out. But it does just show that if you use good management practices overall, you can keep those dry matter losses within a certain level. And if you use real best management practices, do everything, you can get an even better job done. So it's really all about controlling the two ends of the ensiling process, that rapid initial pH drop, and then keeping the feed stable at feed out so that we don't get any heating or any spoilage. And at the end, the takeaway message, the bottom line, if you like, is that what dictates the quality of the silage that you're going to get above everything is the quality of the material that comes out of the field. If you've got poor quality of the material coming out of the field, you're done. It's going to be poor quality silage at the end of the day. But if you've managed to raise a good crop and you practice poor management skills, you're going to end up with poor quality silage. But if you get a good crop coming out of the field and you use good management skills, best management skills, you will end up with high quality feedable silage that you can feed at reasonable high levels to beef cattle as well as dairy cows and get good performance. That good management practices, it's summarised in that technical guide that you've all got as a takeaway. We also have qualitysilage.com is a website of ours that you can go to for further information as well. And basically that's me done just about on 31 minutes. Sorry, Galen. Went over by a minute.
Questions for Charley? We got that. Dan, anything on mic? Yeah. No questions.
Stunned silence. It must be the reference to Star Wars in the paper that's...
I read that part.
You referenced our ability to harvest the crop
Yeah,
at a much faster rate than we can
yeah,
decide.
yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, yeah, the growth and development of the harvesting machinery is outstripping the capacity of, in certain circumstances, of people to pack adequately the silage and even get it, like into the pile or pit, fast enough. The stuff is arriving faster than they can process it. Though having said that, it can be done. I mean, I don't have the photograph in this presentation, and I'm not sure if it's in the handbook, but I have a photograph courtesy of one of my colleagues, a guy called Paul Howard, which he refers to as the monster, and it's a huge drive-over pile, and there are, I don't know if it's 5 or 7 packing tractors rolling over it to do. So, I mean, you can throw more equipment at it, but you've got to realise that, if you go to that University of Wisconsin spreadsheet, you can put in all the parameters that you're playing with, and it'll tell you how much packing weight you've got to put in, how many tractors you've got to put in. And if you use that simple calculation that I gave you, it'll tell you how much packing weight you need and stuff like that. And you can't scrimp. Well, you can, but you're going to pay for it, basically. You have to try to achieve those things. I mean, these are guidelines, and they are ideals. The closer you get to the ideals in each step, the better material you have. And obviously, the overall ideal is you do everything ideally. But, in reality, there's always going to be some parameters you can't control, but let's try to control the parameters that we can, like how much packing weight do I need? You can control that. If you need to bring in another tractor, you can bring in another tractor from somewhere.
What about the starch digestibility comment that you made as far as testing monthly or I didn't catch that.
Yeah, I said monthly or every 2 weeks. I'll repeat the question. Question's about starch digestibility, and I made the comment that the starch digestibility changes over time, and I had stated that, like, if you're feeding out during that active dynamic period, one should check the starch digestibility on a monthly or even better every 2 week basis. And it really is, once you see the starch digestibility plateau, then it's plateaued and you can stop, but during that active period, the starch digestibility, if you go back to that graph, was changing at about 5% a month. Well, you imagine feeding the same ration for 2 or 3 months in succession without accounting for that. At the worst, you're going to be leaving, like material on the table, basically. You're going to be feeding more fermentable carbohydrates than you need to. At the worst, you could be pushing the animals into acidotic shock, because they're getting more rapidly digestible carbohydrate than you've calculated, basically. So if you're in that period of dynamic change, it's important really to keep on top of it, to keep measuring the starch digestibility so that you know what you're feeding, basically.
Very good. Let's thank Dr.
Thank you.